She kind of came in late to the basketball scene, but when she came, she was a force.
She was one of the top guards in Memphis, which, got her a scholarship. And something tells me, like, turn around. So I'll go back to her room, and this time I turn on the lights.
The blood was along the wall, there was blood on the floor, on the bed.
Hello, 911.
You're really just left with a lot of questions. What went down here in this apartment?
And she kind of shoved me, and I kind of shoved her back.
It was a fire waiting to be started. It just needed the right match.
30 minutes from Nashville, Murfreesboro, Tennessee is home to Middle Tennessee State University.
MTSU is a commuter college. There are very few people who live on campus, so most students end up renting apartments.
Raiders Crossings Apartments, which is located on South Rutherford. It's maybe about 10 minutes from campus. Just apartments that are normally rented by students who are going to MTSU.
On March 2nd, 2011, at 6:45 p.m., the Murfreesboro Police Department receives a 911 call from the complex.
911 emergency.
Yes, I just need a police dispatcher to go to Raiders Crossings and check in the last building, just knock on the third floor door.
For what?
I heard Biden.
Please put on a low priority. This because it was not high priority at the time. No one has physically seen anything, just suspicion, so you don't want to rush to a scene like that.
Moments later, a more urgent call comes in.
Hello, 911. Man, where are you at? Where are you at?
He gives the address. It's the same as the first call.
What's going on?
My daughter came and my girl's bleeding to death. Please! Tina, please, keep moving, Tina. Keep moving, Tina. Tina, keep moving, Tina. Oh, Lord. Yeah, somebody call her.
Okay, we've already got police and ambulance on the way.
Now, it's concrete, you really got something, so now we got to step it up because someone's in danger. It's time to roll.
When the officers arrive, the male caller meets them outside. He identifies himself as Casey Anuna.
He was very distressed and was screaming for help.
I was like, man, someone stabbed my girlfriend, your apartment number.
One of the officers spots a woman ducked behind a row of cars. Then she takes off running.
You're just thinking maybe she done did something or something's going on because now you don't know.
Officer Brown was able to catch up. He sat her down on the parking lot and began asking her questions. And she immediately just responded that her roommate had been in a fight, was injured, possibly dead, and that she didn't know anything else that was going on.
KC shows a second officer to the apartment.
Officer Christy English ran inside of the apartment to check on the victim and immediately try to start giving her CPR and helping her. She had been stabbed right above the heart in the chest, and she had several other cuts in her upper torso area.
Casey identifies the victim as his girlfriend, 21-year-old Tina Stewart.
I know she's a fighter. That's one thing I knew. And sometimes, they tell you pray. So I'm telling God, make it happen.
Clantina Tina Stewart was born October 17, 1989, and raised in Memphis, Tennessee.
She was a tough little girl growing up, and that toughness carried her onto the basketball court.
She was a extremely great high school athlete. starting in the 10th grade, 11th grade.
She kind of came in late to the scene, like the basketball scene. Even though she was older than me, I still had been playing longer than her. But when she came, she was a force. Like, it was crazy. She came out of nowhere.
My senior year, you know, she was, you know, one of the top guards in Memphis. And if you're one of the top guards in Memphis, you're one of the top guards in the state. And which, you know, got her a scholarship to one of the best programs in Tennessee.
In the summer of 2008, Tina headed to Murfreesboro to begin training at Middle Tennessee State University.
The men's basketball team was in the weight room. We were lifting, working hard, and then I remember the girls' basketball team came in. We were trying to see who the new girls there, who's new on campus, and things like that. So, I mean, that's where I first initially saw Tina Stewart.
He's a basketball player for MTSU, just like Tina. They hit it off from the beginning.
We both had a passion for the same things. So, and it's kind of rare where you have a person who share the same things.
She was a free spirit, you know? She wasn't too much, it was kind of hard to tie her down. But he gave her a little balance, because he wasn't gonna be all over the place, and she wanted to be wherever he was.
This love that we had in college, you know, it was, you know, it was genuine. I would say that, definitely genuine.
After 2 years of living on campus, Tina moved into an off-campus apartment. She was paired with a roommate, 18-year-old Shanterica Madden.
Shanterica was a good student, very studious. She had straight A's throughout high school. She had a full academic scholarship because she had worked so hard as a student. They probably looked at the background that they were both from Memphis and thought, you know, this is probably going to be a good match.
Shanterica knew of Tina because she was, you know, popular basketball, popular staple in the community as far as sports. But Tina didn't know who she was.
When it came to personality, Tina and Shanterica were opposites.
Shanterica Madden is a very sheltered, quiet, withdrawn, introverted mouse of a person. She is not someone who walks in a room and you just immediately gravitate toward, which is the exact opposite of Tina.
Tina, she had tons of friends, very outgoing person. A lot of people loved her.
After living together for a few months, the roommates discovered more differences.
Tina was really clean.
You could tell that Shanterica didn't have a lot of life experience. Like she didn't know how to, you know, clean up a kitchen and maintain cleanliness. She was very sheltered at home.
Shanterica's housekeeping irritated Tina. But it was KC that bothered Shanterica.
Shanterica and Tina had disagreements about Tina's boyfriend, Casey Anuna, staying over.
That was a shocker because when I was over there, I was never like in the areas like long periods of time or, you know, I was always trying to, you know, I'm in the room or I'm gone, I'm out of the apartment. You know, I wasn't trying to be in the same space as them because I understand that, you know, this is not where I stay.
Despite the friction, Tina kept her focus on her studies and basketball.
In the spring, the Middle Tennessee Blue Raiders were scheduled to play in the Sun Belt Conference women's basketball tournament.
But just 3 days before the tournament begins, KC calls 911 to report that Tina has been stabbed. Paramedics arrive.
They started doing CPR on her immediately, even though they could tell she's injured pretty bad.
As paramedics load Tina onto a stretcher, KC goes back outside to speak with police in the parking lot.
I saw the stretcher come down, You know, I'm just like, man, I'm praying even harder now in my mind.
Police begin to establish who's who.
You got a young lady was laying there in a pool of blood.
Casey Anuna is the young man who made the call. The woman who is running from the police is Shanterica Madden.
They had no idea who she was or how she was involved.
At the beginning of an investigation, everybody is going to be a suspect.
Shortly after 7 p.m. on March 2nd, 2011, detectives with the Murfreesboro Police Department are investigating the brutal attack on college basketball star Tina Stewart.
She had a pulse, maybe a faint pulse, and they're gonna keep working on her.
Tina's boyfriend, KC, and roommate, Shanterica, are on the scene when investigators get an update on her condition. They learn that shortly after Tina arrived in the ER, she succumbed to her injuries.
She was pronounced dead at the hospital.
Tina was stabbed from the front and the back. So the wound that was right above her heart is what killed her. She bled from that because it nicked some sort of artery.
The lady, the police officer, she's like, she didn't make it. I just broke down.
Both KC and Shanterica are escorted to the station.
They take me downtown. She been taken in for questioning.
You want to separate the two and get separate statements from each person. That way you can tell what's going on, who's telling the truth.
Detectives go inside Tina's bedroom where the attack took place.
The blood was along the wall. There was blood on the floor, on the bed. It was a very messy crime scene. This was a very violent attack.
But investigators are unable to locate what caused Tina's injuries.
They're looking for any kind of weapons. You got no weapon at this time.
They spot something suspicious in the kitchen.
When they search the apartment, they find a knife block that is missing a couple of knives.
Investigators also collect Tina's phone as evidence. Other than that and the missing knives, the scene yields few clues.
This when you gotta slow down and take all the evidence and start talking to people one-on-one.
Back at the station, detectives sit down with KC. He explains what led to his desperate 911 call.
Casey had got done with practice and he and Tina had dinner plans. He sent a few text messages and the response that he got just didn't sound like Tina.
I get a text back like I'm in the shower. I look at it and I'm just like, you know, I've been dating this girl for 3 years. It's not how she texts.
He stated that she was more emotional. She sent emojis, I love you, more lovely-dovey type stuff, to where this was more generic.
You know, I see you later, not the letter C, she's spelling it out. And this person's not texting like that. I was living with my fraternity brother, a great friend of mine, and I told him, man, I want to go over to Tina's place. I don't feel right about it, you know? And I go to her apartment complex, I touch the door handle, and I was like, you know, I knocked.
Shanterica answered the door.
I was like, is Tina here? She's like, I haven't seen her. No, she's not here, I haven't seen her. So I was like, all right.
KC tells investigators that he decided to check her room anyway.
So I walk down the hallway. In the very back room is Tina's room. The door's open, and the TV's on, but the lights are off. So I'm just like, I kind of look back, you know, and I don't hear anything. I don't look down. I don't look. She's not on the bed. I just like, she's not in here. I just like, you know. So I walk back out, and I'm walking towards the door, and I'm like, you sure you ain't seen Tina? You know, she's like, her voice changes, like, no, I haven't seen her.
Casey made note of something he hadn't seen before.
Shanterica, he noticed she had bags and stuff packed too, and just about to go out the front door.
And something tells me, like, turn around. So I turn around and I go back to her room, and this time I turn on the lights. That's when I see Tina laying flat. So the first thing I said, we joke a lot. You know, we play. So I was like, get up, stop playing. Then I see the blood. I rush to her, I turn her over, and I see the blood everywhere. And I'm just like, my mind's everywhere. I'm trying to talk to Tina, like, hold on, fight, you know. Little to no response, but she still some life, you know. So I'm talking to her and call 911.
Shanterica heard him calling out.
She kind of had her head in the door and saying, it's not me, I didn't do it, I didn't do it, I didn't do it, I didn't do it. So she takes off. That's when I just kind of go towards, go after Shanterica. I don't want her to get away.
Responding officer came to the scene and saw him running after her.
Then I got downstairs and that's when I was stopped.
You're really just left with a lot of questions. You know, what exactly happened? What was the cause of all this? What went down here in this apartment?
On the night of March 2nd, 2011, police in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, are investigating the fatal stabbing of 21-year-old Tina Stewart.
Her boyfriend, KC, is being questioned, and there's no reason to think that he might have done this. He's cleared pretty early on as a suspect.
KC tells investigators that he can't think of anyone who would want to harm Tina.
Like, I knew everything about this girl, Tina Stewart. You know, she told me everything. So it's like, nah, there was no other troubles going on.
Although Casey does admit that tension between Tina and Shanterica was running high.
It was mostly about the cleanliness of, or the lack of, with Shanterica, leaving things around. You know, Tina was a very, you know, neat person. Then it was like taking things or touching things without permission as far as food, and she smelling the marijuana.
Shanterica started smoking weed in the apartment, regardless of whether Tina was there. And that was a big problem for Tina.
For Tina, since she's an athlete, she gets regular drug tests. And we learned that Shanterica is a casual marijuana user. Tina, you know, doesn't want this around her. She doesn't want to end up failing a drug test from secondhand smoke.
And she want to lose her scholarship, and she also want to be in good standing with her coach, because now, you know, if I'm a star player and I'm busted with marijuana, she might not play me, and there go my hopes and dreams.
She was just like, look, I'm not your mom, not your dad. You're in college, just don't do it in the house.
Investigators prepare to interview Shanterica. But first, they speak with an officer who says he paid a visit to the apartment just before the stabbing, at Tina's request.
He was a off-duty officer living at the apartment complex. We call him a courtesy officer. Your job is to answer any call at the complex. Loud party call, 3 in the morning, you go answer it. So he got a call from the office manager that there was somebody smoking marijuana at the apartment.
The courtesy officer made his way out there. Shanterica's asking, who called on me for this? How did you even find out about this? And Tina's coming out of her room saying, I'm the one who called.
He told Shanterica to toss out the weed, not to do that again. He didn't make a formal complaint. I think that he was just trying to calm the girls down.
Did tensions between the roommates rise even higher after Tina made the call? Investigators asked Shanterica.
I understand that apparently earlier this evening there was some sort of altercation between you and your roommate.
Shanterica says that shortly before 6 p.m., she was hanging out in the apartment with her friend Nene when the courtesy officer arrived.
I guess my roommate had called the front desk, and the front desk sent the police over. And I talked to him, and he was basically like, if he searched my room and he didn't find anything, then it'll be cleared. And if I told him the truth, so he searched, and he was like, well, you told the truth. And he said, but he's still gonna have to talk to the manager.
Already, investigators have caught Shanterica in a lie. They know that the courtesy officer found marijuana because they've already talked to him.
And after he left, I talked to Tina, which is my roommate. I talked to her. Then I knocked on her door and told her that I need to talk to her. And we talked. And it kind of got heated because we both kind of had attitude. And she kind of shoved me, and I kind of shoved her back. And then the next thing I know, we was fighting. She kind of just slammed my head, so she was pounding my head, and I was pounding her face. And just with my hand.
Okay.
And then she pushed me to the ground. When she had my head, she pushed me to the ground, so I was right on the ground. And I gathered her. And she was like, get out of my room, get out of my room. So I left.
According to Shanterica, Nene left the apartment soon after, and Tina was right behind her.
My roommate, she was doing something. I think she was putting on her shoes because I seen her kind of roam around moving, because that's normally what she was doing. And she turned down her TV, and she put on her jacket, and she walked out the door.
Shanterica says she also left.
I walked all around the parking lot, kind of because I was trying to get out the nerves out of my system. And I didn't shut the door, I just kind of shut it. I didn't lock it, I didn't bring my keys with me.
And then she said on her way out, she did notice that there was a guy hanging out the dress that she'd never seen the complex before.
She says there's a man with dreadlocks who was in the area, who was carrying a knife.
When she returned to the apartment a little while later, the front door was open.
The door was still, it was like, wasn't closed. I kind of shut it.
The front door?
I shut the door, and it wasn't closed. It was kind of like cracked, so I just thought she came back.
She says that Tina must have come back while she was gone, and this dreadlocked man must have attacked her.
He black, he got dreads, and he kind of tall, but everybody taller than me. But he got probably like 5'6". And this is the third time I've seen him over there.
Detectives don't buy it. This whole story seems made up and really unlikely.
Now, you're at a critical point right now, all right? You're at a fork in the road, okay? And I want to help you choose the right fork. Something bad happened tonight.
But Shanterica sticks to her story.
All I know, I did not kill Tina. Tina was perfectly fine when I left.
She is very, mechanical in her movements, the way she talks, the way she responded to detectives. During the whole interview process that night with police, she might as well have been a robot.
Investigators noticed something else about her behavior.
During her interview, the whole time she's kind of using a card and kind of picking the blood off the ends of her fingers.
The fight she described having with Tina wouldn't have left blood on her hands, so where did that blood come from?
Hours after the death of Tina Stewart, Murfreesboro police interview her roommate, Shanterica Madden.
They noticed that she had been absent-mindedly picking dried blood from the tips of her fingers during the interview. They're gonna go hard on her now.
Listen to me, okay? Now, I'm gonna be straight with you, okay? And I've been doing this for a long time, okay? And you've got some marks on your face. I've been sitting here looking. It looks like your cheek might be a little bit swollen. I think What happened was you and Tina got to an argument, got to a physical fight that got a little out of hand. Another thing I find interesting is that you're right-handed, you got blood right here on the crook of your right hand.
She stuck to it for the longest, till she finally started breaking down slowly. And finally she said, well, I'm gonna tell you the truth.
When we talked about whatever it was, I turned around and was heading into my room, and I think I kind of bumped into her, and she was like, don't bump into me. And she shoved me, and I shoved her back.
The fighting escalated, and Shanterica knew she was outmatched.
She says that when she and Tina were fighting, she was scared because Tina was an athlete and much stronger than her.
I kept saying, that hurt, because my head started paining real bad. And she had a knife sitting, I think it was on the bed. So, I don't know what she was doing. She was cutting something. But she had a knife sitting on the bed, and I grabbed that knife after, because she still had my head down. She was pounding on the head, and I grabbed the knife and just kind of went like this. When she was coming towards me, I kind of went like this, and I just held it and let it up, and she fell.
She does admit that she stabbed Tina, but says, of course, that it was in self-defense.
I didn't mean for this to happen.
And the problem with the whole thing is, why didn't you call the police at that time?
I had my phone in my hand. I was like, I need to call somebody. And I was gonna go call the police. I had my phone, but I couldn't find the number that I wanted to call.
Where's the knife at now?
I don't remember. I don't remember if I dropped it or I took it outside when I went outside. I don't remember.
You remember, because we didn't want it to be sitting out there in that field or something, and some kid get a hold of it or something like that.
I don't think so. Okay. I can't remember.
Investigators get word that officers back at the crime scene may have the answer.
A neighbor saw Shanterica around the dumpster just after this incident occurred. Police check it out. They do find a knife wrapped in a blanket that's covered with blood and is obviously their murder weapon.
This knife also matches a knife found in the apartment.
Investigators confront Shanterica with the new evidence.
They finally went to the dumpster and found the knife and the blanket, so now I got a piece of the evidence. And now I'm gonna tell Miss Madden, I have this.
Shanterica changes her story again.
She does admit that she basically just freaked out afterwards and decided to get rid of the knife in the dumpster.
She didn't call 911, but instead went to dispose of the knife. That puts another dent in her claim of self-defense because it looks like she was trying to hide what she'd done.
Meanwhile, news of Tina's death has brought the MTSU campus to its knees.
The Lady Raiders were well loved. This particular team was very well known because they were very talented and they were just very popular. This whole situation shocked everyone more than I think that anybody really understood.
Police hold a press conference to officially announce Tina's death. They also ask anyone with any information about the crime to call in.
At 6:20 p.m., Shanterica's friend, Renee Nene Reese, calls police.
Renee Reese tells police that she was there when the security officer came to the apartment and when Shanterica confronted Tina.
Renee Reese, friend to accused killer Shanterica Madden, tells investigators that she was in the apartment when an off-duty police officer was summoned by Shanterica's roommate, Tina.
And then as soon as he left, she said that Miss Madden immediately went to Tina's room, knocked on the door, and confronted her.
She says Shanterica was mad at Tina for calling the off-duty officer on her, and they started arguing, and it got heated quickly.
She said she went back into Miss Madden's room because they was arguing very loudly, and she wouldn't be a part of it, and she could hear banging and arguing.
Renee says she also heard someone saying, "She got a knife," and "Stop, my heart hurts," or "My heart is beating," something like that. At some point, things got quiet. Then Shanterica knocked on the bedroom door and Renee let her in. Shanterica said, "We have to go." Renee saw blood on Shanterica's arm, so she asked Shanterica what happened to Tina, and Shanterica said she left. Renee says she glanced towards Tina's room.
She did say that she could see Tina's leg hanging through the doorway. So she did see it, that she was down and injured, so she knew something was wrong.
Renee says she grabbed her purse and headed for the door.
In the living room, she said she saw Shanterica holding a blanket, stuffing it in a big, clear plastic bag. As she was leaving the apartment, she saw Shanterica drop the bag and a piece of knife fell on the floor. Renee says Shanterica tried to hand her the bag.
She asked her actually to throw it away for her. She said, "No, I'm not gonna do that."
Renee left. She tells police that she placed the first call to 911.
Okay. All right. What's your name?
I don't want to say my name. I don't feel comfortable saying my name.
Shanterica tried to get her friend to help her cover up the crime. She didn't call 911. This is not looking like self-defense.
They charged her with first-degree premeditated murder.
News of Shanterica's arrest is another blow to the stunned community.
When she was officially charged, I wouldn't say it was a sign of relief. I just wanted justice to be served, you know?
Tina was a superstar in Memphis. You know, everyone knew who she was.
Investigators focus on building their case.
They know from the start that she's going to show up to court claiming self-defense, so they need to be able to counter that.
Investigators discover a series of postings on Tina's social media from the day of her death.
Before the incident, Tina was on Twitter blasting Shanterica on social media, saying that she didn't care anymore, that she was over it. She was sick of the situation.
At 5:37 p.m., Tina tweeted, "I just called the police on my roommate. I feel like a snitch, but I don't like this."
You could see where she didn't really want to tell on her, but then again, she didn't want to lose her scholarship, so she was put in a hard place. So what do? You do what you need to do.
At 5:58 p.m., Tina tweeted, "Police is here." Then a minute later, "This gonna be too hot." And finally, her last tweet at 6:01 p.m., "I hope he finds some, please, please."
Tina saw how much she had on the line. Shanterica had everything to lose as well if her parents found out that she was doing weed. So they both had a lot to lose. It was a fire waiting to be started, honestly. Like, it just needed the right match.
Investigators speak with Tina's friend, Scooter Macklin. She tells them she was on the phone with Tina when Shanterica came in to confront her.
She asked Tina why she didn't let her know what was going on, but Tina's response was, "I had already spoken to you earlier this week about this situation being a situation and that it couldn't be one. This is what happened, this is the result." And she left the room. Like, me and Tina started back talking on the phone. She left the room for like 45 seconds, maybe a minute, and then she came back.
Miss Stewart was on the phone with Miss Backlund up to like 6:04, and the phone just connected.
And I'm calling back, but I didn't get a response. But by then, I got a text message that said, "Finna get in the shower, I'll call you right back."
By the time she gets that text, police think that Tina is bleeding out and Shanterica is trying to buy time by sending texts from her phone.
She did not try to help Tina. Instead, she tried to hide the truth about the situation.
On March 11th, 2011, 9 days after Tina Stewart was found dead, Shanterica is released on a $100,000 bond.
Shanterica didn't have any history of violence beforehand. She had never been arrested. She didn't have a juvie record.
I was the most disappointed about the fact that she was able to post bond. She posted bond and went to Memphis and went to the mall. My phone was going crazy again. Most people couldn't believe that she had the audacity to just be walking around in the world like that.
On May 9th, 2012, Shanterica Madden goes on trial for first-degree murder.
The courtroom stayed packed more than I'd ever seen it. Just overwhelming the number of people that came out to support Tina and her family. And Shanterica's family was there during the whole trial. Her mom and dad were right there in the front row behind the defense table the whole time.
Just as prosecutors anticipated, Shanterica pleads not guilty, claiming she acted in self-defense. She takes the stand to tell her version of events.
Tina confronted Shanterica and that Shanterica was acting in self-defense and that she just happened to see the knife that was in Tina's room on the bed and then grabbed the knife. The knife was already in Tina's room because Tina had been eating a snack or something and there was a knife on the bed. But it just happened to be there. And so she used that in self-defense in the heat of the moment.
Prosecutors argue that the forensic evidence tells a different story.
The blood spatter showed that Tina had been stabbed from behind initially, and then at some point had turned around and tried to defend herself. That aligns with what the coroner found during the autopsy.
You can see on her hands she was cut, and she was trying to defend herself from being attacked.
Tina was stabbed in her back, upper torso area at one point, so that doesn't lend itself to a self-defense argument.
They also argue that the knife wasn't on Tina's bed.
Nobody had ever seen Tina leave dirty dishes or food just sitting out on the bed. That was not her personality whatsoever. She was very clean, conscientious about being clean, and she usually didn't eat in her bedroom.
As soon as she went to grab the knife, she was formulating the plan, was their argument. That she had to make a willful decision to pick up the knife and to use it.
Shanterica did not immediately call 911. She did not try to help Tina. Instead, she immediately started trying to hide evidence, knowing full well that her roommate was bleeding to death on the other side of the wall.
On May 14th, the jury reaches a verdict.
The jury found her guilty of second-degree murder and tampering with evidence. They concluded that, yes, she was guilty, but they couldn't definitively say she planned this murder.
Later at sentencing, Shanterica received 29 years in prison, 25 for the second-degree murder charge, and 4 years added onto that for the tampering with evidence charge.
29 years versus a person that's lost their life, it's not equal. It's not equal. You shouldn't be able to, she can come out and still be able to at least do something, experience something, whereas Tina can't.
I've been watching the March Madness in the Final Four.
September 18th, 1992, began like countless other mornings in Canada's Northwest Territories. The sky above Yellowknife was pale, the northern air sharp enough to sting exposed skin, and a cold wind swept across the rocky landscape surrounding Giant Mine. From a distance, The mine looked almost ordinary, a sprawling industrial complex built to wrestle gold from one of the harshest environments on Earth. Massive steel structures stood against the horizon, conveyor belts stretched across the property, and trucks rolled methodically over gravel roads worn smooth by decades of heavy machinery. It was a place where danger was accepted as part of the job. Every miner understood that the Earth itself could be unpredictable. Rockfalls, equipment failures, underground fires, these were the risks they signed up for every time they descended beneath the surface. But on that Friday morning, the greatest danger wasn't hidden inside the rock. It had been carefully placed there by human hands. Hundreds of feet below the frozen ground, the tunnels of Giant Mine twisted through the earth like veins. Darkness swallowed everything beyond the reach of a miner's helmet lamp. The air carried the familiar scent of diesel fuel, damp stone, machine oil, and explosive residue. Every sound echoed endlessly through the confined passageways, the rumble of engines, the scrape of steel wheels against narrow tracks, the distant hum of ventilation fans struggling to force fresh air through miles of underground tunnels. For the men working there, those sounds meant routine. Routine meant survival. Routine meant another shift completed safely. At approximately 10:30 that morning, a small underground rail vehicle began making its way toward one of the working levels nearly 750 feet below the surface. 9 men sat aboard the vehicle, talking quietly as miners often did before beginning another shift. Some had already spent weeks inside the mine. Others were still adjusting to the demanding work beneath the earth. They came from different towns, different provinces, and different walks of life, but they shared one simple purpose. They had accepted a job. None of them knew they were riding toward an execution. Far ahead, almost invisible against the walls of the tunnel, a thin wire stretched across the track. It was so small that no one would have noticed it until it was too late. Attached to that wire was nearly 85 pounds of industrial explosives. Not explosives intended to break apart solid rock. Explosives arranged with a single purpose: to kill whoever crossed that point. There would be no warning. No shouted command. No flashing light. No opportunity to stop. The rail car rolled steadily forward. Steel wheels clicked rhythmically over the tracks. The headlights pierced only a narrow corridor through the darkness. Inside the vehicle, the men had no reason to believe this morning would end differently from any other. Perhaps one of them was thinking about lunch. Perhaps another was counting the days until he could return home. Perhaps someone was planning a phone call to his wife after the shift ended. Ordinary thoughts. Ordinary lives. Ordinary men. Then the rail car reached the wire. For a fraction of a second, absolutely nothing seemed different. Then the underground world exploded. A violent blast ripped through the confined tunnel with unimaginable force. Unlike an explosion in the open air, the pressure had nowhere to escape. It slammed into the tunnel walls and reflected back again, multiplying its destructive power. Steel twisted as though it were made of paper. Chunks of rock tore loose from the ceiling. Dust instantly filled every inch of space. The air itself became a weapon. The explosion was so powerful that there was virtually no chance of survival. 9 lives ended in an instant. Hundreds of feet above them, workers near the surface felt a faint vibration beneath their boots. At first, some assumed it was simply another scheduled blast inside the mine. Controlled explosions were part of everyday operations. No one panicked immediately. Then the radios came alive. Voices overlapped. Questions replaced routine communications. Supervisors stopped what they were doing. Engineers rushed toward the control room. Within minutes, the atmosphere across Giant Mine changed completely. Something had gone terribly wrong. Emergency crews raced underground despite not knowing exactly what awaited them. Every rescue mission inside a mine carries enormous risk. A damaged tunnel can collapse without warning. Toxic gases can build within minutes. Fires can spread through ventilation systems. Yet the rescuers kept moving deeper into the darkness, navigating around shattered rock and clouds of choking dust. When they finally reached the destroyed rail car, the silence told them everything they needed to know. There was nothing left to rescue. What they found was not the aftermath of an industrial accident. It was the scene of a massacre. As word spread across Yellowknife, confusion quickly turned into disbelief. How could something like this happen? Had there been a catastrophic equipment failure? Was it a mining accident unlike any seen before? Had a natural gas explosion somehow occurred? The answers came slowly. Too slowly for the families waiting by their telephones. Too slowly for the wives who expected their husbands home that evening. Too slowly for the children who believed their fathers were simply working another shift. Investigators soon reached a conclusion that stunned not only Yellowknife but the entire country. This had not been an accident. The explosion had been deliberate. Someone had planted a bomb. In a single moment, the tragedy transformed from an industrial disaster into one of the deadliest acts of mass murder in modern Canadian history. The realization sent shockwaves through a community that had already spent months living under extraordinary tension. Long before the explosion, Giant Mine had become something far more dangerous than a workplace. It had become a battlefield. A bitter labor dispute had divided friends, neighbors, and even family members. Men who had once trusted each other underground now refused to make eye contact. Conversations had been replaced by accusations. Handshakes had become clenched fists. The strike had poisoned relationships throughout the community, creating an atmosphere where anger lingered in every parking lot, every union meeting, every security checkpoint, and every newspaper headline. Acts of vandalism became increasingly common. Threats were exchanged openly. Vehicles were damaged. Property was sabotaged. Explosives had already been used not against people, but against equipment and buildings. Each incident pushed the conflict a little further. Each confrontation made compromise a little less likely. Yet even in that climate of hostility, almost no one believed anyone would cross the final line. No one imagined that the hatred would eventually be buried beneath hundreds of feet of solid rock, waiting patiently for 9 unsuspecting men. The most chilling part of this story is not simply the explosion itself. It is the planning behind it. Whoever built that trap understood the mine intimately. They knew the underground transportation system. They knew the daily schedule. They knew exactly where the rail vehicle would pass. They knew precisely how much explosive would be needed to ensure that no one survived. This was not an act of sudden rage. It was calculated, methodical, patient. Every detail suggested that someone had spent days, perhaps weeks, preparing for a single horrifying moment. The questions began immediately. Who could possess that level of knowledge? Who had access to industrial explosives? Who hated enough to turn a workplace into an execution chamber? And perhaps the most disturbing question of all. How many warning signs had been ignored before September 18th? Over the months that followed, investigators would conduct one of the largest criminal investigations ever undertaken in Canada's north. Hundreds of interviews would be carried out. Thousands of pieces of evidence would be examined. Entire neighborhoods would find themselves caught between fear and suspicion. Friends would question friends. Co-workers would wonder if they had unknowingly shared coffee breaks with a murderer. The search for answers would last more than a year. But on that cold September morning, none of those answers existed. There were only 9 families waiting for news that would forever change their lives. 9 empty seats at dinner tables. 9 unfinished conversations. 9 futures erased beneath the earth. The Giant Mine murders would become more than a criminal case. They would become a haunting reminder that the deadliest weapons are not always created in secret laboratories or carried onto distant battlefields. Sometimes they are assembled inside an ordinary workplace by someone who once stood shoulder to shoulder with the very people he would ultimately condemn. To understand how such an unimaginable crime became possible, we must go back to the beginning, before the explosion, before the investigation, before the headlines. We must return to a remote northern town built on gold, where economic desperation, broken trust, and growing resentment slowly transformed an industrial dispute into one of the darkest chapters in Canadian history. The story of the Giant Mine murders cannot be understood by looking only at the explosion that claimed 9 lives on September 18, 1992. To understand why the tragedy occurred, it is necessary to travel back several decades and to a place unlike almost anywhere else in North America. Yellowknife sits on the northern shore of Great Slave Lake, deep within Canada's Northwest Territories. Long before it became the capital of the territory, it was a rugged frontier community shaped by mining, isolation, and resilience. Winters regularly stretched for more than half the year. Temperatures could plunge well below -40 degrees Celsius, while the landscape transformed into an endless expanse of snow, ice, and exposed rock. Life in the north demanded perseverance. Nothing came easily, and almost everything, from groceries to construction materials, had to travel great distances before reaching the community. For many residents, however, the harsh climate was outweighed by one promise: gold. The discovery of gold deposits during the 1930s transformed Yellowknife from a remote settlement into one of Canada's most important mining communities. Prospectors, engineers, tradesmen, mechanics, and laborists arrived from across the country, hoping to build stable lives in a region that offered opportunities unavailable elsewhere. Mining became more than an industry, it became the foundation of the local economy and the identity of the town itself. Among the mines that emerged during this period, none became more significant than Giant Mine. Commercial production began in 1948, and over the following decades the operation became one of Canada's most productive gold mines. Thousands of workers would spend their careers underground, extracting millions of ounces of gold from the surrounding rock. The mine employed generations of families, supported local businesses, and helped shape Yellowknife's growth into a permanent northern city. Working underground, however, was never easy. Every shift demanded discipline and trust. Hundreds of feet beneath the surface, miners depended on one another for survival. Ventilation systems supplied breathable air. Heavy machinery moved constantly through narrow tunnels. Explosives were used daily to break apart solid rock, making careful planning and strict safety procedures essential. Even experienced miners understood that a single mistake could have fatal consequences. Because of these conditions, a strong sense of solidarity often developed among crews. Underground, personal differences mattered less than competence and reliability. Every worker needed confidence that the person beside him would follow procedures and respond calmly during emergencies. This shared dependence helped foster a powerful labor culture, one in which unions played a significant role in protecting wages, safety standards, and working conditions. For decades, many employees viewed Giant Mine as more than just an employer. It represented financial security in one of Canada's most remote regions. The wages were relatively strong, and many workers planned their futures around long careers in the mining industry. They bought homes, raised children, and became active members of the community, believing the mine would continue operating for years to come. But by the early 1990s, the economic landscape had begun to change. Gold prices weakened in international markets, placing increasing pressure on mining companies. Operating a remote mine in the Northwest Territories was expensive. Transportation costs were high, equipment required constant maintenance, and the extreme climate added further challenges. Like many resource companies facing declining revenues, Royal Oak Mines searched for ways to reduce expenses and improve profitability. Management argued that significant cost reductions were necessary if Giant Mine was to remain financially viable. Proposed changes included wage reductions, adjustments to employee benefits, and modifications to working conditions. From the company's perspective, these measures were difficult but necessary business decisions intended to preserve the operation. Many workers saw the situation very differently. Employees believed they were being asked to sacrifice the security they had spent years helping to build. Many had already endured demanding conditions far beyond what most Canadians experienced in southern provinces. They questioned why they should bear the burden of falling gold prices while continuing to perform dangerous work underground. Negotiations between management and the union became increasingly strained. Each round of discussions produced more frustration than progress. Trust gradually eroded. Statements became sharper. Positions hardened. By the spring of 1992, the relationship between the company and the union had deteriorated dramatically. The dispute escalated into a lockout and strike involving approximately 240 unionized workers. Royal Oak Mines chose to continue operating the mine by hiring replacement workers, often referred to as strike replacements. That decision fundamentally changed the nature of the conflict. For many striking miners, the issue extended beyond wages or benefits. They viewed replacement workers as individuals who had undermined collective bargaining efforts. To those who crossed the picket line, however, the situation appeared quite different. Many had accepted employment simply because they needed work. Some traveled long distances for the opportunity, seeing the position as a chance to support their own families during difficult economic times. The result was a deeply divided community. People who lived on the same streets found themselves on opposite sides of an increasingly emotional conflict. Local businesses became gathering places for heated conversations. Friendships were tested. Families sometimes disagreed over the strike. News reports closely followed each new development, while residents wondered how long the dispute could continue. Unfortunately, tensions did not remain confined to negotiation tables. Throughout the summer of 1992, authorities documented numerous incidents connected to the labor dispute. Equipment was damaged. Property was vandalized. Threats were reported. Security measures around the mine increased substantially as company officials attempted to protect employees and infrastructure. The atmosphere became one of constant suspicion. Every unfamiliar vehicle attracted attention. Every confrontation carried the potential to escalate. Police maintained an active presence, and private security personnel were brought in to monitor access to the mine. Despite these precautions, daily operations continued. Replacement workers arrived for their shifts. Management remained determined to keep the mine functioning. Union members continued their demonstrations, insisting that their concerns deserved meaningful resolution. Months passed with little indication that either side was prepared to compromise. Looking back today, historians often describe this period as one in which multiple warning signs were present simultaneously. Economic uncertainty, prolonged labor conflict, declining trust, and repeated acts of intimidation created an environment that was increasingly volatile. Yet even under those circumstances, few people believed events would culminate in a deliberate act of mass murder. Most labor disputes, however bitter, eventually end through negotiation, legal action, or changing economic conditions. Communities recover. Relationships slowly rebuild. Life moves forward. Yellowknife expected its conflict to follow a similar path. Instead, it would become the setting for one of the darkest chapters in Canadian labor history. The events that unfolded in September 1992 would permanently alter the community's understanding of how quickly unresolved conflict can escalate when anger, fear, and polarization replace communication and trust. Before investigators searched for evidence, before courtrooms examined responsibility, and before the country debated accountability, Giant Mine had already become a symbol of a community under extraordinary strain. It was within that atmosphere, defined by economic pressure, fractured relationships, and months of unresolved hostility, that the stage was set for a tragedy that would forever change Yellowknife and leave a lasting mark on Canadian history. Long before their names appeared together in newspaper headlines, they were simply ordinary men living ordinary lives. They came from different provinces, different backgrounds, and different generations, but they shared something that millions of working people around the world understand. They believed that hard work could provide stability for the people they loved. The men who boarded the Underground Rail vehicle on the morning of September 18, 1992, were not public figures. They were not politicians, celebrities, or powerful executives. Most Canadians had never heard their names before that day, and many outside the Northwest Territories had never even heard of Giant Mine. Yet each of those 9 men represented an entire world to someone else. A husband, a father, a son, a brother, a friend, a co-worker. When history remembers the Giant Mine murders, it often focuses on the labor dispute, the criminal investigation, or the legal proceedings that followed. Those are important parts of the story, but they can unintentionally overshadow the people whose lives were taken. Behind every statistic is a family whose future was permanently altered. Yellowknife in the early 1990s attracted people willing to accept difficult work in exchange for opportunity. Mining had always demanded sacrifice. Employees worked long shifts in dangerous conditions, often far from extended family. The winters were long and unforgiving. Darkness dominated much of the year. Yet for many workers, the rewards justified the hardships. A steady income meant mortgage payments could be made. Children could attend school with the supplies they needed. Families could build a future that might have been impossible elsewhere. Some of the replacement workers who arrived at Giant Mine had traveled hundreds or even thousands of kilometers after hearing that jobs were available. Canada's economy was facing challenges of its own, and stable employment was difficult to find in many regions. Accepting work in the North was not necessarily an ideological statement. For many, it was simply an economic decision. The labor dispute surrounding Giant Mine was already well known when they accepted those positions. They understood they would be entering a workplace experiencing significant conflict. Security was visible. Demonstrations occurred outside the mine. Tensions were openly discussed in local news reports. Even so, most believed that while the atmosphere might be uncomfortable, the law and workplace safety measures would ultimately protect everyone involved. Like countless workers throughout history, they expected arguments. They expected hostility. They expected difficult days. They did not expect that accepting a job would eventually cost them their lives. Among those men was Chris Neal. Those who knew him remembered someone who valued responsibility and took pride in his work. Mining was physically exhausting, but it also required concentration and discipline. Every task underground demanded attention because mistakes could have serious consequences. Co-workers described many miners at Giant Mine as individuals who developed routines that helped them stay focused. Equipment checks became habits. Conversations often revolved around safety procedures, shift schedules, and family life waiting back home. Joe Pandev was another of the 9 men whose life ended that September morning. Like many miners, he understood that the profession demanded resilience. Long hours beneath the earth left workers physically drained, but they returned day after day because their families depended upon them. For loved ones waiting at home, each completed shift brought quiet relief. Every safe return reinforced the expectation that tomorrow would unfold much the same way. Norm Huri had also become part of that routine shared by mining communities across Canada. The work created bonds among crews because every person relied upon the competence of others. Underground, trust was not an abstract concept. It was essential for survival. David Vodnowski, Shane Riggs, Robert Rosell, Malcolm Sawler, Arnold Russell, and Vern Faloka each brought their own experiences and hopes to Giant Mine. Their personal stories differed, yet they were connected by the common belief that honest labor could improve the lives of those they cared about. It is easy, decades later, to view them collectively as the 9 victims. History often compresses individual lives into a single phrase. But each of those men had memories stretching back long before Giant Mine. They had childhoods shaped by different communities across Canada. They had learned trades, developed friendships, celebrated birthdays, and imagined futures beyond the next paycheck. Some looked forward to family gatherings. Others planned vacations once enough money had been saved. Some hoped eventually to leave the demanding world of underground mining altogether. Those plans disappeared in an instant. The morning of September 18th began much like countless others. Workers prepared for another shift according to established routines. Protective equipment was checked. Conversations were exchanged before reporting underground. Coffee cups were emptied. Jackets were zipped against the northern cold. There was nothing extraordinary about the beginning of that day. For families at home, the morning unfolded with equal normality. Children left for school. Spouses began their own workdays. Daily chores filled the hours. No one imagined that routine would soon be interrupted by devastating news. One of the most heartbreaking realities surrounding industrial communities is the quiet confidence families place in routine. Mining is undeniably dangerous, But safety procedures exist because everyone understands those risks. Loved ones learn to live with uncertainty by trusting experience, training, and established systems. When a minor leaves home before dawn, family members naturally expect to see him again that evening. That expectation becomes part of everyday life. On September 18th, that expectation was shattered. The explosion underground was so sudden and so destructive that there was virtually no opportunity for warning or escape. Above ground, confusion spread rapidly as emergency procedures were activated. Information during the first hours remained incomplete. Families searched desperately for confirmation. Telephone calls multiplied. Rumors circulated throughout Yellowknife before official notifications could be completed. Those waiting for answers experienced one of the most painful forms of uncertainty. Hope and fear existed simultaneously. Some believed their loved ones might have survived. Others feared the worst but refused to accept it without confirmation. As rescue teams worked underground, every passing minute became heavier than the last. Eventually, the truth became impossible to avoid. 9 men had not survived. For the families, time seemed to divide into 2 distinct chapters. Life before September 18th. Life after September 18th. The consequences extended far beyond the immediate loss. Empty chairs at dinner tables became permanent reminders of absence. Birthdays arrived without fathers. Wedding anniversaries became occasions marked by grief rather than celebration. Children grew older carrying memories that would never be updated by new experiences. Parents buried sons they had expected to outlive. Communities often speak about collective tragedy, but grief is ultimately experienced in deeply personal ways. Each family mourned differently. Some sought privacy. Others chose to speak publicly about their loved ones. Many struggled with questions that had no satisfying answers. Why had adequate protection not prevented such a crime? Could more have been done to recognize escalating risks? How had a workplace dispute deteriorated into irreversible violence? These questions would eventually become part of court proceedings, public inquiries, and civil litigation. Yet before legal responsibility could be debated, families first had to confront unimaginable loss. In the years that followed, the names of the 9 victims became central to efforts ensuring that the tragedy would not be remembered solely through the identity of the perpetrator. Memorial services emphasized not the circumstances of their deaths but the lives they had lived. Friends remembered conversations, shared meals, long shifts underground, and ordinary moments that suddenly became priceless memories. The Giant Mine murders left deep scars on Yellowknife. The city mourned not only because 9 lives had been taken, but because many residents recognized how interconnected their community truly was. Even people who had never met the victims understood that the tragedy could not be separated from the place they all called home. Today, more than 3 decades later, the victims continue to occupy a central place in the history of Giant Mine. Their names remind us that behind every major criminal case are human beings whose lives cannot be measured by headlines or legal records. They were workers who believed they were beginning another ordinary shift. They were family members expected home by evening. They were individuals whose futures ended beneath the earth while the people who loved them waited above, unaware that the ordinary morning they had just shared would become their final goodbye. Their stories remain the emotional foundation of this case, reminding us that the true cost of violence is never counted only in statistics, but in the countless lives forever changed by a single irreversible act. Friday, September 18, 1992, began much like any other working day at Giant Mine. The late northern summer was already giving way to autumn, and the mornings in Yellowknife carried the unmistakable chill that signaled another long winter was approaching. Employees reported for work according to schedules that had become routine after months of labor unrest. Security procedures remained in place, replacement workers continued to arrive under close observation, and managers focused on keeping production moving despite the ongoing strike. To an outside observer, the operation appeared tense but functional. Behind the security checkpoints, heavy equipment continued to operate. Maintenance crews inspected machinery. Underground supervisors reviewed assignments for the upcoming shifts. Communication between surface operations and underground crews followed familiar procedures developed through decades of mining experience. Every task depended on timing, coordination, and strict adherence to safety protocols. Yet beneath that appearance of routine, the mine remained at the center of one of the most divisive labor disputes in modern Canadian history. For months, relations between the company and striking union members had steadily deteriorated. Incidents of vandalism, threats, and property damage had heightened concerns about security. Law enforcement agencies and company officials were well aware that emotions remained volatile. Additional precautions had been introduced, but no security measure could eliminate every possible risk within a vast underground mining complex. At approximately 10:30 that morning, a rail vehicle carrying 9 replacement workers entered the underground transportation system as part of normal operations. The men aboard were traveling to their assigned work area hundreds of feet below the surface. Similar journeys had taken place countless times before. Underground rail transportation was an essential part of moving personnel efficiently through the extensive network of tunnels that stretched beneath Giant Mine. According to the subsequent criminal investigation, an explosive device had been concealed along one section of the underground route. The device had been assembled using industrial explosives available within the mining environment and connected to a triggering mechanism positioned so that it would activate when the rail vehicle passed. When the vehicle reached that location, the explosive detonated. The blast occurred inside a confined underground tunnel, where the surrounding rock significantly intensified its destructive effects. Emergency responders later determined that the force of the explosion caused catastrophic damage to the rail vehicle and the immediate tunnel area. The confined environment also complicated rescue efforts by filling sections of the tunnel with debris and creating hazardous conditions for emergency personnel attempting to reach the scene. Workers elsewhere in the mine quickly realized that something extraordinary had happened. Communications became increasingly urgent as supervisors attempted to determine the location and severity of the incident. Initial reports were fragmentary, and no one immediately understood exactly what had occurred. Emergency procedures were activated without delay. Mine rescue teams, already trained to respond to underground emergencies such as cave-ins, fires, and equipment accidents, began organizing a response. Their work required exceptional caution. Entering a damaged mine always involves significant risk. Structural instability, poor visibility, damaged ventilation systems, and the possibility of additional hazards all had to be considered before rescuers could advance safely. As rescue personnel moved toward the affected section of the mine, they encountered extensive damage that slowed their progress. Every decision had to balance urgency with the safety of those attempting the rescue. The difficult conditions underground meant that confirming the situation took valuable time. Eventually, rescue teams reached the destroyed rail vehicle. Their findings confirmed the worst fears of everyone waiting on the surface. None of the 9 workers aboard had survived the explosion. The realization transformed what many had initially feared was an industrial accident into something entirely different. Investigators examining the damaged tunnel quickly identified evidence indicating that the explosion had not resulted from an equipment malfunction, an accidental detonation, or a natural hazard associated with mining operations. The evidence pointed toward deliberate human action. This conclusion fundamentally changed the response. Responsibility shifted from emergency management alone to a major criminal investigation involving the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. Preserving evidence became a priority alongside recovering the victims and securing the underground site. Access to portions of the mine was carefully controlled while investigators documented the scene and began reconstructing the sequence of events. Above ground, the emotional impact spread rapidly throughout Giant Mine and across Yellowknife. Workers emerging from underground encountered growing uncertainty as information gradually became available. Some learned of the tragedy through supervisors. Others heard fragments of conversations before official confirmation reached them. News traveled quickly through the close-knit mining community, where many employees knew one another personally. Families faced an agonizing period of waiting. Because communication from underground remained limited during the emergency response, relatives were forced to rely on incomplete information as authorities worked to identify those involved and notify next of kin. For many families, the hours following the explosion became an unforgettable period marked by uncertainty, fear, and hope that gradually gave way to devastating confirmation. Local officials also faced immediate challenges extending beyond the mine itself. The labor dispute had already created significant divisions within the community. News that an explosion had claimed multiple lives raised concerns about public safety, potential retaliation, and maintaining order while investigators determined exactly what had occurred. Media organizations across Canada quickly began reporting on the incident. Initial coverage reflected the uncertainty surrounding the event, with early reports focusing on the explosion itself before investigators publicly confirmed that the evidence indicated a deliberate bombing. As additional facts emerged, the tragedy received national attention. The scale of the crime shocked Canadians. Mining accidents, while tragic, were unfortunately familiar within the country's industrial history. A deliberate attack targeting workers inside a functioning mine was something entirely different. It represented an unprecedented act of violence in the context of a labor dispute and immediately prompted broader questions about workplace security, labor relations, and the escalation of conflict. Within Yellowknife, reactions reflected the complexity of the situation. Many residents experienced profound grief for the victims and their families. Others struggled to comprehend how tensions that had been visible for months could culminate in such an act. Community leaders urged calm while emphasizing the importance of allowing investigators to determine responsibility through evidence rather than speculation. For employees who continued working at Giant Mine, the psychological impact proved significant. The underground tunnels that had once represented routine workplaces now carried entirely different associations. Confidence in familiar routines had been shaken. Every descent below the surface became a reminder of the tragedy that had unfolded there. The mine itself also entered a period of heightened security. Investigators examined not only the immediate crime scene but also broader questions regarding access to explosives, security procedures, and operational practices. Understanding how the device had been assembled and placed without detection became a critical component of the investigation. As the day progressed, authorities confirmed the identities of the 9 victims and began notifying their families. Across Canada, communities connected to those men entered mourning. Flags were lowered. Memorial services were planned. Co-workers gathered to remember colleagues whose lives had ended while performing what they believed would be another ordinary day's work. The tragedy also intensified public discussion surrounding the ongoing labor dispute. While negotiations had previously centered on wages, benefits, and working conditions, attention now shifted toward accountability, safety, and the consequences of prolonged hostility. Many observers questioned whether warning signs had been underestimated during the months leading up to the bombing. Those questions would become central themes throughout the investigation and later legal proceedings. In the days immediately following the explosion, however, investigators remained focused on establishing the facts. Who had constructed the explosive device? How had it been placed inside an active mining operation? What planning had been required? And perhaps most importantly, who possessed both the knowledge and opportunity necessary to carry out such a crime? The answers would not come quickly. The investigation would extend for more than a year, involving hundreds of interviews, forensic examinations, surveillance efforts, and extensive analysis of evidence collected from both the underground crime scene and the broader Giant Mine operation. September 18, 1992, ultimately became far more than the date of a devastating workplace tragedy. It marked the beginning of one of the largest and most complex homicide investigations ever undertaken in Canada's north. The explosion had ended 9 lives within seconds, but its consequences would continue to shape Yellowknife, the mining industry, and Canadian labor history for decades to come. The search for those responsible had only just begun, and investigators faced the difficult task of uncovering the truth within a community already fractured by months of conflict and mistrust. By the afternoon of September 18, 1992, Giant Mine was no longer simply the site of a workplace tragedy. It had become an active crime scene unlike any investigators in the Northwest Territories had encountered before. The immediate priority remained ensuring that the underground environment was safe enough for rescue personnel, recovery teams, and investigators to enter. Only after those hazards had been addressed could authorities begin the painstaking process of determining exactly what had happened. The confined nature of the underground tunnel presented significant challenges. Unlike an outdoor crime scene, the explosion had occurred hundreds of feet below the surface in a narrow passage designed for mining operations rather than forensic work. Debris covered the track, visibility was limited, and investigators had to work carefully to avoid disturbing evidence that might later prove essential. Early examinations quickly ruled out several possibilities that are commonly considered after underground explosions. Investigators found no indication that the blast had resulted from a natural accumulation of flammable gas, nor did the evidence support a catastrophic mechanical failure involving mining equipment. The damage pattern was inconsistent with an accidental industrial explosion. Instead, the physical evidence suggested that the explosion had originated from a deliberately positioned explosive device. This conclusion immediately changed the direction of the investigation. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police assumed responsibility for what was now a homicide investigation. Additional investigators, forensic specialists, and technical experts were brought in to assist. Given the scale of the incident and the complexity of the underground environment, authorities recognized that the investigation would likely require considerable time and resources. The crime scene itself became one of the most important sources of evidence. Forensic specialists documented the damaged tunnel, the condition of the rail vehicle, and the distribution of debris. Every fragment of metal, wiring, and explosive residue was examined to determine how the device had been constructed and where it had been placed. Investigators sought to reconstruct the sequence of events leading up to the detonation using the physical evidence rather than assumptions or speculation. One question quickly became central. Who possessed both the knowledge and opportunity to carry out such an attack? The use of industrial explosives immediately narrowed the range of possibilities. Mining operations routinely relied on carefully controlled explosives for legitimate blasting activities. Access to such materials was subject to safety procedures, inventory controls, and specialized training. Investigators therefore focused considerable attention on individuals familiar with underground mining operations and those who understood the mine's layout. The location of the device also appeared significant. According to evidence presented later during court proceedings, the explosive had been positioned along a section of the underground transportation route used by personnel traveling to their assigned work areas. The placement suggested familiarity with normal operating procedures and the movement of underground rail vehicles. Investigators were careful not to draw conclusions prematurely. They understood that a major criminal investigation required evidence capable of withstanding judicial scrutiny. Public pressure for immediate answers was considerable, but investigators emphasized that establishing responsibility would depend on facts rather than rumor. Above ground, Yellowknife entered a period marked by uncertainty. News of the bombing spread rapidly throughout the community. Local residents sought information through news broadcasts, newspapers, and conversations with friends and co-workers. Because Giant Mine had long been one of the region's largest employers, many people had personal or professional connections to individuals involved in the labor dispute. As public attention intensified, so did speculation. Some wondered whether the attack had been carried out by a single individual. Others questioned whether more than one person had been involved. Authorities consistently urged caution, reminding the public that the investigation remained in its earliest stages and that no conclusions should be reached without evidence. The labor dispute inevitably became part of the investigative context. 4 months before the bombing, relations between Royal Oak Mines and the striking union had remained highly contentious. Numerous incidents involving threats, vandalism, and property damage had already been reported. Those events did not establish responsibility for the bombing, but they demonstrated that investigators were examining a crime committed within an environment of prolonged conflict. As a result, the investigation expanded rapidly. Hundreds of interviews were conducted with current employees, former employees, contractors, security personnel, union representatives, and others connected to Giant Mine. Investigators sought to establish timelines, verify movements, identify possible witnesses, and determine whether anyone had observed suspicious activity before the explosion. Each interview contributed another piece to an increasingly complex picture. Some individuals provided information regarding workplace tensions. Others described the atmosphere surrounding the strike. Many simply recounted ordinary observations that, while seemingly insignificant on their own, could later assist investigators in reconstructing events. At the same time, forensic laboratories analyzed evidence recovered from the tunnel. Specialists examined explosive residue, components of the triggering mechanism, and other materials recovered from the scene. These examinations aimed to identify the type of explosives used and to better understand how the device had been assembled. Investigators also reviewed security procedures at Giant Mine. Questions emerged regarding access to explosives, storage practices, and movement within the underground operation. Determining how the device could have been placed without detection became an important aspect of the inquiry. Meanwhile, the emotional impact of the tragedy continued to unfold. Memorial services were held for the 9 victims as families, co-workers, and community members gathered to honor their lives. Public expressions of grief were accompanied by calls for accountability and a thorough investigation. Community leaders emphasized the importance of allowing the justice system to establish responsibility based on evidence rather than emotion. The investigation soon became one of the largest criminal inquiries ever undertaken in Canada's north. The RCMP committed substantial personnel and resources to the case. Search warrants were executed where investigators believed relevant evidence might exist. Documents were reviewed, physical evidence catalogued, and investigative leads pursued across multiple jurisdictions as necessary. Despite these efforts, progress proved slow. The underground environment had complicated evidence collection. Many potential witnesses possessed only partial information. Rumors circulated widely, making it essential for investigators to distinguish verified facts from speculation. As weeks turned into months, frustration grew. Families of the victims wanted answers. Residents of Yellowknife wanted reassurance that those responsible would be identified. Investigators, however, remained committed to building a case supported by reliable evidence rather than rushing toward conclusions that might not withstand legal examination. Throughout this period, authorities maintained that every lead would be investigated thoroughly. No single interview, forensic result, or witness statement was considered sufficient on its own. Instead, investigators worked to assemble a comprehensive understanding of the events before, during, and after September 18. The process reflected the complexity of major homicide investigations, particularly those involving carefully planned acts committed in specialized industrial environments. Although the identity of the person responsible had not yet been established publicly, the investigation was steadily narrowing its focus through accumulated evidence, forensic analysis, and witness testimony. What initially appeared to be an almost impossible case was gradually becoming more defined. The physical evidence recovered from the mine, combined with months of investigative work, would eventually provide the foundation for the breakthrough that followed. That breakthrough would fundamentally alter the direction of the investigation and ultimately bring the case before a Canadian court, where the evidence collected during these painstaking early months would be examined in detail. As the weeks following the bombing stretched into months, the Giant Mine investigation evolved into one of the most extensive homicide inquiries ever conducted in Canada's north. What had begun as an emergency response inside an underground mine had become a painstaking search for the individual responsible for planning and carrying out a deliberate act that claimed 9 lives. Investigators understood from the outset that solving the case would require patience. Unlike crimes committed in public places with numerous eyewitnesses, this attack had occurred deep underground, in an isolated environment where physical evidence was limited and reliable testimony would be difficult to obtain. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police assembled a multidisciplinary investigative team. Detectives worked alongside forensic specialists, explosives experts, crime scene analysts, and intelligence officers. Every available source of information was examined. Mine records, employee schedules, security logs, explosive inventories, maintenance reports, and transportation records were reviewed repeatedly. Investigators knew that somewhere within thousands of pages of documentation and hundreds of interviews, the facts would eventually begin to align. The first challenge was establishing opportunity. The explosive device had not appeared by chance. It had been placed in a specific section of the underground rail system, at a location where investigators believed the perpetrator expected a personnel carrier to pass. That immediately suggested planning and familiarity with the mine. The person responsible almost certainly understood the underground layout, knew the transportation routes, and possessed knowledge of industrial explosives commonly used in mining operations. Those conclusions naturally narrowed the investigative focus. Attention centered on individuals with direct experience inside Giant Mine. Current employees, former employees, contractors, supervisors, and others familiar with underground operations all became part of the investigative process. This did not mean they were considered suspects simply because they worked at the mine. Rather, investigators recognized that understanding the mine's unique environment was essential to understanding how the crime had been committed. Hundreds of interviews followed. Some lasted only a few minutes. Others extended for hours. Detectives asked witnesses to describe ordinary routines in extraordinary detail. They wanted to know who had been seen underground, which areas had unusual activity, whether anyone had expressed extreme anger, and whether any suspicious behavior had been noticed in the weeks before the bombing. Many interviews produced little more than fragments of information. A passing conversation. An unusual comment. A vehicle seen at an unexpected location. A disagreement remembered differently by different witnesses. Individually, these details appeared insignificant. Collectively, they helped investigators reconstruct the broader environment surrounding the crime. The ongoing labor dispute complicated every aspect of the investigation. The strike had divided the community into opposing groups whose trust in one another had already been severely damaged. Some individuals were reluctant to cooperate, fearing they might be viewed as betraying colleagues. Others worried that innocent people could become targets of suspicion simply because of their position during the labor conflict. Detectives therefore faced not only the challenge of gathering evidence but also of overcoming an atmosphere of deep mistrust. Investigators were careful to separate emotion from evidence. The existence of intense labor tensions did not establish criminal responsibility. Although the bombing had occurred during one of the most bitter industrial disputes in Canadian history, detectives understood that assumptions based solely on conflict could easily lead an investigation in the wrong direction. Every allegation required corroboration. Every statement had to be tested against physical evidence and independent witness accounts. Forensic work continued throughout this period. Specialists examined components recovered from the underground tunnel, studying the explosive residue and the triggering mechanism. They sought to determine how the device had been assembled, how it had been activated, and whether its construction revealed anything about the individual who built it. Investigators also reviewed access to explosives. Industrial explosives were tightly controlled within mining operations, but the nature of the work meant that many experienced miners understood their proper handling and legitimate use. Detectives carefully examined inventory records, storage procedures, and operational practices to identify any irregularities that might assist the investigation. The inquiry gradually expanded beyond the mine itself. Homes were searched where investigators believed relevant evidence might exist. Telephone records were examined where legally authorized. Financial records and personal histories were reviewed when they appeared relevant to the case. Detectives followed leads throughout the Northwest Territories and into other parts of Canada whenever new information emerged. Some leads proved promising at first. Later, they reached dead ends. Other tips appeared insignificant until they were reconsidered alongside newly discovered evidence. The investigation became a process of constant reassessment. No possibility was dismissed without examination. Months passed. Public frustration inevitably increased. Families of the victims continued waiting for answers. Community members wondered why no arrests had been made. National media periodically revisited the case, asking whether investigators were any closer to identifying the person responsible. The RCMP remained cautious in its public statements. Officials consistently emphasized that complex homicide investigations often require significant time, particularly when prosecutors must ultimately prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Investigators preferred to build a complete case rather than make a premature arrest unsupported by sufficient evidence. Within Yellowknife, daily life slowly resumed, but the bombing remained impossible to ignore. The labor dispute continued. Conversations throughout the community frequently returned to the investigation. Rumors spread quickly. Names circulated privately. Speculation often outpaced confirmed facts. Authorities repeatedly reminded the public that rumor could interfere with the investigation and unfairly damage innocent individuals. Behind the scenes, detectives continued assembling pieces of an increasingly complicated puzzle. They compared witness statements collected months apart, looking for consistencies and contradictions. They revisited earlier interviews after new evidence emerged. They reconstructed timelines repeatedly, measuring every known movement against the available physical evidence. As often occurs in major investigations, the breakthrough did not arrive dramatically. Instead, progress came through persistence. Gradually, investigators began focusing greater attention on one individual whose background, experience, and alleged statements attracted increasing interest. That individual was Roger Warren, a longtime Giant Mine employee and union member. During the labor dispute, Warren had become known for his strong views regarding the strike and the use of replacement workers. Investigators examined those circumstances carefully, but they also recognized that strongly held opinions, by themselves, were not evidence of homicide. Their task remained proving actions rather than motives alone. The investigation continued for more than a year after the bombing. Then, in October 1993, the case took a dramatic turn. Roger Warren provided a statement to investigators admitting responsibility for placing the explosive device that caused the September 18 explosion. 4 detectives who had spent more than 12 months examining evidence, conducting interviews, and following countless leads, the confession represented a major development. It provided investigators with information that could be compared directly against the physical evidence already collected throughout the inquiry. As the criminal proceedings later revealed, Warren would subsequently retract that confession, arguing that it had not been given voluntarily. That claim immediately introduced a new legal issue that would become central during the court process. Investigators and prosecutors would ultimately need to demonstrate that the broader body of evidence, not merely the confession itself, supported the charges. By this stage, however, the investigation had moved beyond a search for an unknown offender. Attention shifted toward preparing one of the most significant criminal prosecutions in Canadian history. Every interview conducted during the previous year, every forensic examination, every recovered fragment, every investigative decision, all would soon be tested inside a courtroom. For the families of the 9 victims, the confession brought a mixture of emotions rather than simple relief. After more than a year of uncertainty, investigators had identified the man they believed was responsible. Yet identifying a suspect was not the same as securing a conviction. The criminal justice system still had to examine the evidence openly, fairly, and thoroughly. The investigation had uncovered a suspect, but the pursuit of justice was entering its most demanding phase. In court, every conclusion reached by investigators would face rigorous scrutiny. The defense would challenge the confession, question the evidence, and test the prosecution's case piece by piece. Only then would a jury decide whether the evidence established, beyond a reasonable doubt, responsibility for one of the deadliest acts of workplace violence in Canadian history. For more than a year after the bombing at Giant Mine, investigators lived with the weight of an unsolved case that had shaken the entire country. Every interview, every forensic report, every search warrant, and every piece of physical evidence had been collected with extraordinary care, yet none of it had produced the decisive breakthrough that the victims' families desperately wanted. The investigation had become one of persistence rather than speed. Detectives understood that a case involving 9 counts of homicide demanded evidence capable of surviving the scrutiny of a criminal trial. Suspicion alone would never be enough. As the months passed, investigators continued revisiting earlier interviews, comparing witness statements, and re-examining evidence recovered from the underground crime scene. Rather than treating each lead in isolation, they began looking at the investigation as a series of interconnected events. Patterns gradually emerged. Certain statements were supported by physical evidence. Timelines became clearer. The reconstruction of events inside the mine grew increasingly detailed. By the autumn of 1993, the investigation reached a pivotal moment. On October 22, 1993, Roger Warren, a longtime Giant Mine employee and union member, met with investigators. During that interview, he admitted responsibility for placing the explosive device that detonated inside the underground tunnel on September 18, 1992. For the investigative team, the confession represented the most significant development since the bombing itself. The importance of the statement extended beyond the admission of guilt. Investigators compared the information Warren provided with the evidence that had already been gathered during more than a year of investigative work. They examined whether details contained in the confession were consistent with the physical characteristics of the crime scene, the construction of the explosive device, and the known sequence of events established through forensic analysis. This comparison was essential. Experienced investigators understand that a confession must never replace evidence. Instead, it must be evaluated alongside independently verifiable facts. A reliable investigation is built by determining whether statements can be corroborated through objective findings rather than accepted without question. Following the confession, authorities formally arrested Warren and charged him in connection with the deaths of the 9 miners. For the families of the victims, the arrest brought complicated emotions. Some expressed cautious relief that the investigation had identified a suspect after more than a year of uncertainty. Others remained reserved, recognizing that an arrest did not automatically establish guilt in court. Many continued to focus less on the identity of the accused and more on the lives that had been permanently lost. The broader community of Yellowknife also reacted with mixed feelings. The labor dispute had already divided neighbors, co-workers, and longtime friends. News of the arrest intensified those divisions. Some believed the investigation had finally reached the correct conclusion after months of careful work. Others questioned aspects of the investigation and urged that every piece of evidence be examined thoroughly during the judicial process. The criminal justice system was now entering a new phase. Investigators shifted much of their attention toward preparing the case for prosecution. Every report completed during the investigation would potentially become evidence. Detectives reviewed interview transcripts, organized forensic findings, and worked closely with prosecutors responsible for presenting the case before a jury. The defense, meanwhile, prepared its own strategy. One of the most significant developments came when Roger Warren withdrew his earlier confession. He argued that his statement had not been given voluntarily and claimed that investigators had pressured him during questioning. The defense maintained that the confession should not be relied upon as evidence of guilt. This development fundamentally changed the legal landscape. Rather than presenting a straightforward prosecution built primarily around an admission of responsibility, prosecutors now needed to demonstrate that the broader body of evidence independently supported the charges. The case would ultimately depend not on a single statement but on the totality of the evidence collected throughout the investigation. The prosecution therefore focused on presenting a comprehensive picture. Evidence regarding the construction of the explosive device. Evidence concerning the underground location where it had been placed. Evidence addressing access to explosives. Evidence concerning familiarity with the mine's layout and transportation routes. Witness testimony describing the broader circumstances surrounding the labor dispute. Each component was intended to contribute to the overall narrative presented in court. The case also highlighted the importance of forensic science in modern criminal investigations. Physical evidence recovered from the underground tunnel remained central throughout the proceedings. Experts explained their findings to the court, describing how they reached their conclusions using established investigative methods. Their role was not to speculate about motive but to assist the jury in understanding the technical evidence recovered from the crime scene. The trial attracted considerable public attention across Canada. Journalists closely followed the proceedings, recognizing the significance of the case not only because of the number of victims but also because the crime had occurred during one of the country's most contentious labor disputes. Public discussion frequently extended beyond the courtroom, prompting broader conversations about workplace conflict, public safety, and the responsibilities of employers, unions, and government institutions during prolonged industrial disputes. Throughout the proceedings, the court remained focused on the evidence. Witnesses testified under oath. Experts explained technical findings. Lawyers questioned the reliability, significance, and interpretation of the evidence presented. The adversarial process ensured that both the prosecution and the defense had the opportunity to examine every major aspect of the investigation. For the families seated inside the courtroom, the experience was emotionally demanding. Each day required them to revisit events they had spent years trying to understand. Testimony describing the investigation, the crime scene, and the circumstances surrounding the bombing served as a constant reminder of the profound losses they had suffered. Yet many family members continued attending the proceedings, believing it was important to witness the judicial process firsthand. Outside the courtroom, life in Yellowknife gradually continued. Businesses reopened. Schools remained in session. Mining operations evolved under increased scrutiny. Yet the memory of September 18, 1992, remained deeply embedded within the community. The bombing had altered relationships, challenged public confidence, and demonstrated how prolonged conflict could produce consequences extending far beyond the immediate workplace. As the trial approached its conclusion, the central question before the jury became increasingly clear. The issue was not whether a terrible crime had occurred. That fact had never been disputed. The issue was whether the evidence presented throughout the proceedings established, beyond a reasonable doubt, that Roger Warren was criminally responsible for placing the explosive device that killed 9 workers at Giant Mine. After carefully considering the evidence, the jury reached its decision. In January 1995, Roger Warren was found guilty on 9 counts of second-degree murder. The verdict marked the culmination of years of investigative work involving hundreds of interviews, extensive forensic analysis, and one of the most complex criminal prosecutions in the history of Canada's North. For many of the victims' families, the verdict represented an important step toward accountability, though it could never erase the loss they had experienced. Justice, in the legal sense, had been achieved through the criminal courts, but grief followed a different timeline, one measured not in court dates or legal decisions, but in the lasting absence of those who never returned home from work on that September morning. With the verdict delivered, attention turned to sentencing and to the broader legacy of the Giant Mine murders. The courtroom had determined criminal responsibility, but the tragedy continued to raise larger questions that extended beyond one individual: how such an act became possible, whether earlier warning signs could have been addressed, and what lessons Canada could draw from one of the darkest episodes in its labor and criminal justice history. Those questions would shape the final chapter of the story long after the trial itself had come to an end. By the time the trial reached its final stages, more than 2 years had passed since the explosion at Giant Mine. For the families of the 9 victims, those years had been measured not by calendars but by court appearances, investigative updates, and the painful process of rebuilding lives forever changed by a single morning in September 1992. The criminal proceedings had become far more than a legal exercise. They represented an opportunity for the facts to be examined openly and for the justice system to determine responsibility through evidence rather than speculation. Throughout the trial, the courtroom served as the setting where months of investigative work were carefully presented before the jury. Prosecutors methodically outlined the evidence gathered by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police during one of the largest homicide investigations ever conducted in Canada's North. Witnesses described the labor dispute that had divided the Giant Mine community, while forensic experts explained the physical evidence recovered from the underground crime scene. Each witness added another piece to a case that had taken years to assemble. The defense challenged many aspects of the prosecution's case. Particular attention focused on Roger Warren's confession. After initially admitting responsibility during an interview with investigators in October 1993, Warren later withdrew that confession, arguing that it had not been given voluntarily. His lawyers questioned the circumstances surrounding the interview and urged the court to examine the statement carefully. As with any serious criminal proceeding, the court's responsibility was not simply to hear competing arguments but to evaluate the reliability of every piece of evidence. The jury was instructed to consider the entire body of evidence presented during the trial rather than relying upon any single element in isolation. Forensic testimony played an important role throughout the proceedings. Experts explained how investigators examined the underground crime scene, analyzed explosive residue, and reconstructed the placement of the explosive device. They described the methods used to document evidence and the procedures followed to preserve its integrity from the moment it was collected until it was presented in court. Other witnesses described the atmosphere surrounding Giant Mine during the months leading up to the bombing. The labor dispute had become increasingly bitter. Trust between management and striking workers had largely disappeared. Replacement workers entered the mine under heightened security. Acts of intimidation and property damage had already occurred before the bombing. The court heard this evidence not to place responsibility on any broader group but to provide context regarding the environment in which the crime occurred. Throughout the proceedings, the trial remained focused on individual criminal responsibility. Canadian criminal law requires that guilt be established beyond a reasonable doubt. That high standard exists to ensure fairness and to protect the integrity of the justice system. The burden rested entirely with the prosecution, which was required to demonstrate that the evidence supported the charges brought against Warren. As closing arguments approached, both sides summarized their positions before the jury. The prosecution argued that the evidence, viewed as a whole, demonstrated that Warren had planned and carried out the bombing that killed 9 miners. The defense maintained that the evidence did not establish guilt beyond a reasonable doubt and urged the jury to scrutinize every aspect of the investigation carefully. After hearing weeks of testimony and reviewing the evidence presented throughout the trial, the jury retired to deliberate. For the families seated in the courtroom, the waiting was almost unbearable. Many had spent years seeking answers. They had attended memorial services, participated in legal proceedings, and endured repeated public discussion of the tragedy that had taken their loved ones. Now the outcome rested with 12 citizens who had carefully listened to every witness and examined every exhibit introduced during the trial. When the jury returned, the courtroom became silent. The verdict was read. Roger Warren was found guilty of 9 counts of second-degree murder. The decision marked the conclusion of the criminal trial and represented the jury's determination that the evidence established Warren's responsibility for the bombing beyond a reasonable doubt. For some family members, the verdict brought a measure of relief. Not relief because their grief had ended, it had not. Not relief because justice could restore what had been taken, it could not. Rather, it was relief that the criminal process had reached a conclusion after years of uncertainty and that responsibility had been established through the courts. Others experienced more complicated emotions. A guilty verdict could answer the legal question of who was responsible. It could not answer every personal question that remained. Why had the conflict escalated so dramatically? Could earlier intervention have prevented the tragedy? Why had 9 ordinary workers lost their lives during what should have been an ordinary workday? Those questions extended beyond the courtroom. Following the conviction, the court proceeded to sentencing. Roger Warren received a sentence of life imprisonment after being convicted of 9 counts of second-degree murder. Under Canadian law, the sentence reflected both the seriousness of the offences and the legal framework governing second-degree murder convictions. The sentence ensured that Warren would spend many years in custody before becoming eligible for parole consideration under the applicable laws. It is important to understand that parole eligibility in Canada does not mean automatic release. Rather, It provides an opportunity for an independent parole authority to assess whether continued incarceration remains necessary according to legal criteria, including public safety. Any future parole applications would require careful review through the established legal process. In the years that followed, Warren sought parole on several occasions. These hearings reopened painful memories for the victims' families, many of whom continued participating in the process by submitting statements describing the lasting impact of the bombing. Family members consistently emphasized that the consequences of September 18, 1992, had never ended for them. Children had grown up without fathers. Parents had buried sons. Spouses had rebuilt lives while carrying losses that could never truly be repaired. During later parole proceedings, Warren acknowledged responsibility for the bombing and expressed remorse for his actions. Those statements became part of the public record. For some observers, the acknowledgement represented an acceptance of responsibility that had not existed during portions of the earlier legal proceedings. For many of the victims' families, however, expressions of remorse could not alter the irreversible consequences of the crime. The legal system had completed its work. The emotional consequences remained. Beyond the criminal trial itself, the giant mine bombing continued to generate legal proceedings in other forms. Families of the victims pursued civil litigation involving the company and other parties, raising questions regarding workplace safety, security measures, and the protection of employees during the prolonged labor dispute. Those civil cases addressed different legal issues than the criminal prosecution, focusing on questions of responsibility under civil law rather than criminal guilt. The bombing also prompted broader discussion among governments, employers, labor organizations, and workplace safety experts. Many asked whether warning signs had been underestimated. Could heightened tensions have justified additional security measures? Were existing procedures adequate for protecting workers during periods of extreme industrial conflict? These discussions extended well beyond Yellowknife, influencing conversations about labor relations and workplace security across Canada. The giant mine case ultimately became more than a criminal conviction. It became a reminder that unresolved conflict, when combined with deep polarization and deteriorating trust, can produce consequences that reach far beyond the original dispute. The courtroom established criminal accountability for one individual. History, however, continued examining the broader lessons surrounding the tragedy. As the legal proceedings finally came to an end, the community of Yellowknife faced a different challenge. Courtrooms can deliver verdicts. Judges can impose sentences. The justice system can determine criminal responsibility according to law. Yet none of those outcomes can fully restore what has been lost. The families still carried empty places at their tables, co-workers still remembered the colleagues who never returned from their shift, and an entire community continued living with the memory of a day that forever changed its history. The final chapter of the giant mine story would therefore not be written in a courtroom, but in the years that followed, as survivors, families, and the community reflected on the enduring legacy of one of Canada's darkest workplace tragedies. When the courtroom emptied and the headlines gradually became less frequent, many people assumed that the giant mine story had reached its conclusion. The investigation was over. A verdict had been delivered. A sentence had been imposed. From a legal perspective, the case had come to an end. For the families of the 9 victims, however, there was no clear ending. Justice and healing are not the same thing. A criminal conviction can establish accountability, but it cannot restore a father to his children, a husband to his wife, or a son to his parents. It cannot replace birthdays that would never again be celebrated together, anniversaries forever marked by absence, or conversations that ended without anyone realizing they would be the last. Life in Yellowknife continued because it had to. The city still woke each morning beneath the vast northern sky. Businesses reopened. Schools welcomed new students. People went to work, raised families, and adapted to another cycle of long winters and brief summers. Yet beneath that sense of normalcy remained a memory shared by an entire community, a memory that refused to disappear simply because time had passed. For many residents, September 18, 1992, became one of those dates that permanently divides history into before and after. Before the bombing, Giant Mine had symbolized opportunity. For decades it had provided employment, supported local businesses, and helped transform a remote northern settlement into a thriving community. Thousands of families had built their lives around the mine, believing it represented stability in one of Canada's most challenging environments. After the bombing, the mine came to represent something far more complicated. It became a reminder of how quickly trust can collapse when conflict is allowed to deepen without resolution. The labor dispute itself eventually ended, but the divisions it created did not disappear overnight. Relationships that had once been built through years of working together underground had been tested in ways few people could have imagined. Some friendships never recovered. Some neighbors continued avoiding conversations about the strike for years afterward, recognizing that painful memories still lingered beneath the surface. The tragedy also forced Canadians to reconsider assumptions about workplace conflict. Labor disputes have long been part of industrial history. Workers and employers often disagree over wages, safety, benefits, and working conditions. Negotiations become difficult. Emotions sometimes run high. Demonstrations and legal disputes are not uncommon. But the Giant Mine bombing demonstrated what can happen when hostility escalates beyond dialogue and enters the realm of violence. It became a case studied not only by criminal investigators but also by labor historians, legal scholars, workplace safety experts, and conflict resolution specialists. They examined the dispute from multiple perspectives, asking difficult questions about communication, leadership, security, and the warning signs that had emerged during the months leading up to the bombing. Many of those questions have no simple answers. Could stronger security measures have prevented the attack? Could different negotiations have reduced tensions before they reached such dangerous levels? Could warning signs have been recognized earlier? History rarely offers certainty. Instead, it offers lessons. One lesson